Chuck Young, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to dive right in. I've been starting these off by asking a Zen question.
Okay.
I'm curious to see what you have to say about this. The question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to?
Oh, geez. All things return to the one. Where does the one return to? I think that's the paradox because the one returns to all things. So
Yep.
it's an outside to an in, back to an out, I think.
Yeah, that's the way I feel as well. It's been interesting getting different answers on that, but few people have said that. Nathan Springer said returns to the none
Mm.
recently. Some people say the one returns to itself. Some people say there's nowhere for the one to return to because it's never not there. Obviously, the one can mean various things, but okay, I appreciate that. I wanted to ask about your childhood and upbringing a little bit. Did you grow up in a religious family or did you grow up in a religious context at all?
I did. I was raised Catholic. So sort of I'm in like blue collar, small town Irish Catholic world. So I was raised that way, but it was mainly because my parents promised the priest that married them that they would raise their kids Catholic. And that was the only way the priest would marry them because it was their summer after graduating high school. My mother was 4 or 5 months pregnant at the time in the late 70s. So it was, and I don't know when that was sold to me as an idea, but I feel like I always sort of knew that. So being religious or going to church was always obligation more than it was opportunity, right? So my mother was always like, this is something she wanted to fulfill that promise. So it was kind of like, it was basically like, we got to do this. We have to do this. My dad, on the other hand, he was raised Protestant, but he had like a tragedy early in his life. So he took the side of like, oh, there can't be a God. You know, his mom was killed in a plane crash when he was 3. So I think that informed his sort of spirituality when he went, he took the route of there can't be a God if that happened to me, or if there is a God, he's a piece of shit. So I'm just not even going to believe. So I had that sort of dichotomy growing up where we would leave my dad, he'd be, watching the Stooges and my mother and my sister would go off to church and it'd kind of be like, what's that guy up to though? Cause I kind of I like the looks of that. Oh yeah, we got to go to church. So I didn't have really any connection to it. It was just something that I sort of needed to do and get through, but I did the whole thing. I did the communion and confirmation, and I sort of lectured at church in high school. So I sort of, I again, it was sort of expectation. Hey, these are the expectations of you. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'll do it.
Right. Did you, you said you didn't really have much of a personal connection with it, but outside of church, do you feel like you had your own like individualized or personal spirituality of any sort when you were a kid or teenager?
I think the only sort of spirituality I had was, and I think what Catholicism does, one of its things that it does that sort of screws you up is this idea of shame and guilt. So I carried around, these feelings of shame and guilt. So like sort of any kid, it was like, wanting to be sort of forgiven for things that I maybe couldn't control. You think of puberty and you think of all this stuff that you're thinking about and you're changing and you're just like, oh, I'm sort of told that this isn't okay. So please sort of forgive me. And then you're praying, for things. Hey, please let this go. Okay. Please have no one notice that I'm terrified of the world.
Yeah.
But the only sort of, and that was again, sort of, that's like the negative connotations. The only real positive sort of spirituality I had came, I think, with music, just feeling. And I think when we think of spirituality, it's sort of like this call to home almost. And I didn't have that in the church setting. I had that in sort of like the local sort of music scene and hearing music and that feeling of like, that was the first time I went like, oh, I'm not alone. And like, oh, there is somewhere for me to go, not necessarily physically, but sort of metaphysically, oh, there's somewhere for me to go. So that became sort of my spirituality was music and like participating in making music and then, writing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that seems like a common thread too. It's crazy because the more that I do these, the more I'm just kind of seeing these like motifs that seem to be common among a lot of, I don't know, I guess people that I'm drawn to at the very least. I know for me, music was always a very special thing. When I was a kid and a teenager, I didn't think of it as spiritual per se, but I think it definitely was in the way that I think about spirituality now. And yeah, it did give me the impression of like, I'm not alone, whether it was lyrics or just, um, sharing favorite albums with friends and stuff like that. And my best friend from 7th grade, I mean, that was really the cornerstone of a lot of my friendships has been music. And my best friend and I would share CDs all throughout middle school and high school. And we had hundreds and hundreds of CDs. But so you played music when you were a teenager?
I played music, yeah, and I think just to add on to what you're saying, I think there's a vulnerability there, right? Going out on a limb and saying, "Hey, I like this," and listen to this, and that kind of thing. And I wonder, if religion at its best has that sort of thing. Hey, it's a space where you can feel sort of vulnerable, and we have this similar foundation. I think that's why I can recontextualize it as a spiritual thing, because it had those sort of elements and those tenets of like, hey, in this sort of community, you're sort of safe and you can be vulnerable and you're sharing these things and you both have a common sort of ground, but you're growing and you're evolving. So I think that's what organized religion tries to do. I just think they sort of missed the mark a little bit. But yeah, so I kind of was like, I want in on the conversation. Like when I was moved by art or moved by music, I was immediately like, oh, I want to be in on it. I want to like, yeah, I'm moved and I want to move other people. So I started doing music in high school, and then yeah, did a band that we like put out records and we toured and we did the whole thing till I was 23-ish.
Nice.
But yeah, we tried to sort of make a go of it, and that was that was when I started really coming into my own as far as identity was concerned, and that's that's when it became sort of spiritual for me, because it was something that you lose sleep over, and I didn't know why, and I didn't know why I was trying to figure things out in order to put them in songs, in order to have someone listen. It felt like there was a big and there was a big truth. There's a capital T truth somewhere that I had to find. It was my job to figure out, and like I'm losing sleep, and as a creative and as a writer and all these people you've probably talked to, this idea of sort of breaking your back to do something, and then the other side of the coin is like, what am I working so hard for? Why am I like pulling my hair out to get this, to feel like I'm getting this right, or to impart this thing that I've figured out, and what does it mean, and what's sort of the point? And then one of the most freeing things for me was like, there is no there is no truth. It's always fluid. It's always, it's always changing. And that was, that can be terrifying, but that was sort of freeing for me. It was like, okay, I'm not searching for this thing. I'm having my own experience, and no matter, what answers I find, the question's going to change, and I know the question's going to change. Oh,
Yeah.
and is like, oh, what are you doing here? What's the meaning of this? Oh, let me go. Oh, I think I found the answer. Oh, wait, you changed the question on me. You flipped it on me. Now I'm a dad, and what does that mean? Or now I'm this, and what does it mean? You can only go so far as, for me, I was like a drunk, sort of carnival act. It felt like, you can only be a you can only take that life so far, at least for me. And then it was like, oh, okay, now how do I be this new thing? And then it's always, how do I be this new thing?
Yeah, I like that. I like the emphasis, the shift emphasis from trying to find something fixed, some truth that's fixed, and then realizing it's always dynamic, especially because our circumstances are always changing. So at the very least, the questions are always changing and the demands are always changing. What you said about organized religion, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe at its best and in its best like manifestations, it does provide that vulnerability and intimacy and a shared space of openness for people. But so often, like you said earlier, with the guilt and shame thing, that that seems to condition the opposite, where there's not vulnerability and openness, but kind of shame and guilt. And
I
yeah,
think, I think like, I think when you think of unconditional love, right? Having a base of unconditional love, I think about this as a parent, but you can apply it to a God or you can apply it to whatever. As a parent, I want my home to be a place of unconditional love. No matter what you do in this house, know that you are loved, so that you can feel free to go out and experience conditional love. And it's almost an experiment here, with my kids. Hey, because we're at the mercy of our emotions and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, they're gonna have moments where they're maybe like, oh geez, they're gonna feel guilty or ashamed or whatever it is because of
right,
how they acted. And it's still like, no, you're loved, and it's okay. This is the place where you try these things out, and I teach you how to deal with them, so that out in the world, that's conditional, you can make different choices and whatever, but here you're fine. So I think church and religion is kind of like, yeah, you're coming here where you're feeling unconditional love, and
yeah,
you have a secure attachment to Jesus, you know what I mean? And then you can go off and do stuff. But where there's so many rules, it doesn't feel unconditional. It feels very conditional. And maybe I could get one of my kids in here where I go, hey, does it feel conditional? Because they might go, oh, there's a lot of rules here where you're telling me I shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that. And to me, it's like, no, I'm teaching you and I'm reminding you that you're loved. And maybe that's how the church feels. It's like, yeah, no, there's definite rules, but you are, you are somewhere where there's unconditional love. And I think that's where it gets hairy. And we think
right,
about, dynamic and things being fluid, and there not being just one answer and one truth. I mean, religion seems to say, they seem to have none of that. Like, no, it's very static. There is
right.
one truth, and abide by it or whatever. And I think that's what didn't really appeal to me about it. Like all those aspects of it was like, hey, geez, that's not for me. It's the
Yeah,
it's regulation of spirituality, where I need to feel free to sort of figure it out.
right. Oh, I agree. Yeah, yeah. I mean, most expressions of religious truth are, I mean, through dogma or doctrine, and those things are very static. And I guess Buddhism and non-Western religions often have some more wiggle room, I guess. And I mean, Buddhism definitely kind of de-emphasizes final answers in a lot of ways. That's one thing I love about Zen is like every Zen koan, it's for the most part, um, it's trying to like arrest the part of our brain or that wants that final answer, and it's trying to challenge us to not try to cling to a final answer, which is one thing I love about Buddhism. Um, I've been going to this this Unitarian Universalist church in Los Angeles, and it has all of the it honestly it has all of the positive uh, potentials of a really healthy religious community, I think, because for one, it doesn't even require you to have any sort of conventional religious belief at all, belief in God or anything like that. There's a bunch of atheists that go to the church. And there's this emphasis on like the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which is one. There's only like 7 principles of UU, and one of them is that. So I've been lucky to find that, because it does offer that the community of essentially unconditional love, and it also doesn't tie anybody to any sort of static statement of truth either. So it's pretty incredible.
Can I ask you what brought you to that, or what's the driving force to say, hey, I want something like that in my life. I want somewhere to sort of go and to be around people. What's sort of the motivation there?
Well, throughout all of my years from digging into the Bible in college, and kind of like I was going to church. I got pretty deep into like Christianity in my first couple of years of college, and I was going to small group. I ended up leading small group Bible study. And then I started kind of drifting away from that. I got into Buddhism and stuff. And then I kind of started thinking about reality from a more scientific perspective. And I was very like, I was a self-defined, I would be like, I'm agnostic, so I had this kind of agnostic identity for a while. So I've gone through a lot of phases when it comes to spirituality, but throughout all those phases, I have been, I had to just be honest with myself at the end of the day. It's like, I'm just drawn to spirituality. I love to think about it. I love to read about it. And I love to explore different traditions and different ideas. So I've just always had this thirst. I've been a spiritual seeker, I guess is a good way to put it. I've always been a spiritual seeker throughout these years. And I've wanted to find a spiritual community that seemed authentic to me, which was really hard to find, because I didn't want to be tied down to any doctrine or even any one religion. And I've spent a lot of time at the Angel City Zen Center in LA, and I love Zen, I love Buddhism, but I've never been like, I am a Buddhist. I just can't really do that for various reasons. I just don't feel the need to do that. And that doesn't ring true if I just don't say that, and don't think of myself that way. So, it was really a synchronistic experience, because my girlfriend randomly was like, hey, let's just try out like a church around here somewhere. And I was like, because the first Unitarian church is actually in our neighborhood in Koreatown. It's just right down the street. And I had seen it very recently right before she said, hey, let's just like try out a church. And so I was like, if we're going to go to church, let's go to this Unitarian church, because I had heard about Unitarianism through Ralph Waldo Emerson when I got into him in college, because he was a Unitarian minister, and so was his dad. And then Emerson ended up leaving the church, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think I was yearning for a community that I knew was going to be hard to find, because it was going to be, I felt like I was always going to feel a little bit like I was compromising something by being part of any sort of religious community. But then when I found this one, I didn't feel really like I had to compromise anything. And it's been, I guess, maybe 2.5 or 3 years since we've been going. And it's just like, it's awesome. There's not even a minister. It's a different speaker every week. So we get, such a wide range of speakers. It's great. I feel fortunate.
Yeah, I love that idea of like searching for authenticity, especially in a world, obviously culturally, in a world that seems fake, but you being in LA, the epicenter of what people would say is sort of, has a lot of sort of false stuff going on.
Yeah.
I need sort of authentic connection, and I need authentic community. And I like the idea of like, yeah, you got to compromise sometimes for that, and how freeing that must be to not feel like you're compromising to get that. I think that's when I think about other generations, I think about community, and I think about how in neighborhoods, everybody watched everybody else's kids, and the people you went to church with did that, this, that, and the other thing. It wasn't so, you know, individualistic, and it wasn't like, oh, I got to carry all this stuff on me. I got to somehow work, and then I got to take care of my kids, and then I got to do all this alone. You know, it had this sort of sense of community, and I got to think that church played a big role in that. And the further we get away as a, you know, as generations go, we get away from church, we look for it sort of elsewhere, maybe in, you know, the school communities and sports and whatever. And I'm obviously talking about sort of, I'm looking at it from a parent lens, but you can look at it from any sort of lens that you want. But yeah, this idea that, you know, this longing for a community, longing for people to sort of have, you know, I think is
yeah,
prime thing, you know.
you're absolutely right. And I know there's been a lot of studies about, you know, some of the healthy benefits of church communities and stuff like that. And there are some psychological and social benefits, of course. And I think you're also right. Like, we're moving into a world that is getting increasingly non-religious, I would say, even though I think that I've definitely seen a lot of trend toward an interest in spirituality for young folks these days. And I think it's just going to be non-traditional forms of spirituality, I guess, for the most part. And so, yeah, we need to just find ways to preserve communities, because we need communities, obviously. And I mean, even going back to what you were saying about music when you were young, you know, I mean, that was kind of obviously a form of community, is your band, or even just you know, music lovers that you would bond with and stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's a big topic. We can talk more about that, but I do want to I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about music and kind of a search for a truth, or once you got into music, you started feeling like you were like itching to discover something, slash itching to like express some, you know, epiphany or something like that. And I totally know what you mean. And sometimes I think music allows us to feel emotions that we might not even feel if we didn't hear the music. Like, it opens up this world inside of us, and we're like, oh wow, I didn't even know that was there, really. And I think, you know, music always did that for me growing up, and then literature started doing it, you know, and obviously movies as well. So I don't know, do you have anything to say about that, like the power of art, and whether it's music or literature or movies, to kind of open up emotional landscapes and maybe even intellectual landscapes inside of us that wouldn't be unlocked otherwise?
Oh, big time. And I think, you know, what happens, especially with music, is this idea of vibrations, right? That we're, you know, we vibrate at frequencies, and the world vibrates at frequencies, and music, you know, that's part of this opening up, that these frequencies harmonize at some point. And like you said, it unlocks something. I didn't think that when I was listening to, you know, loud punk music or hardcore music. I wasn't like, oh, this is the frequency I'm vibrating on. But it just, you know, it did. It opened up something, and there were layers to it that I couldn't even, you know, I couldn't even necessarily pick apart, but you sort of knew it when you felt it. And for me, it was the power of being moved. It was so powerful, just to be moved, to hear something, see something, and just almost, you know, and just the goosebumps, and your eyes fill up with water, and it's just like, what is happening? And your arm, the hair on your arms is standing up, and it's just like, whoa, it's sort of like, okay, I need more of this. And I think for me, it was a lot like, how do I do the ultimate thing? If this is speaking to me and it's making me feel this way, I'm the best one to speak to me. So I think for me, I was trying to make the music that would speak to me the most, so that when I'm the one creating it, I'm the one playing it. So it's gotta do that sort of tenfold. And I think maybe that was my mindset. If this is opening up this emotional landscape, can I do that to not only open myself up wider, but hopefully open up other people? And it's like, hanging out with, and I feel like it depends on who your friends are. And definitely for music, there was a definite community, and it was very formative for me. And it felt like coming home. And it was a lot of like, that's when I got introduced to sort of politics for the first time. I was just like, oh, people care about this stuff. I'm 14 or whatever from small town Massachusetts. Oh, politics, vegetarianism, veganism, straight edge, all that kind of stuff. And we were a bunch of party animals at 13, 14, 15. And that's what seemed to be the dominant narrative in my town. Oh, we just party and people play football and whatever. So coming to this sort of counterculture thing was like, oh, whoa, yeah, okay. And there was definitely an emotional part. And then it did sort of transition to the intellectual, where it's like, okay, what is going on and what are these layers and how can I do something? And yeah, everything felt like revelatory, like looking at life. I think I always felt like a wallflower to some degree, or like a interested observer, and being able to look at something and then try to sum it up in a thing, and was like, oh shit, I nailed it, and I need to get it in, and then to be like, oh, this is the chorus, and then this is the, and it's almost like you package it, you almost hide it. It's like Trojan horse style, especially if your audience is, kids partying and down at the dam or whatever it is. You like, it can't be too, out there. I mean, my journey as, say, a songwriter, I was trying to be, I think, intellectual. So it was very mumbly and jumbly and whatever. And as I did a project with the dude that I wrote songs for forever. And we did one sort of later, and I was able to simplify it and go, no, I just want to make things that sound good. So you get a chorus that says, like, for my old band, you get a chorus that goes, getting drunk on the blood of their Christ on every Irish Saturday night, making Sunday synonymous with hangover and a forgiveness of the week's sins, because we pray for it all at the end of the day instead of just being good people in the first place. It needed to be this big, deep thing. But imagine singing that. It's just like, no one's going to be able to get the thing going, you know what I mean? And then I'm writing songs later, 8-9 years later, and a chorus is Amy wades waist deep in the lake while James, for her sake, fades into the rain. That just sounds nice. And that's a song. But for me, it was like, oh, I got to get all these big ideas and these big things in there. And I don't want it to be sort of easy and super palatable, even though I'm like super into pop music. It was like, I wanted the lyrics on the page to take you somewhere, and then the song to be able to do that sort of same thing. So yeah, open up your emotional landscape when you're hearing it, but then when you're reading it, open up sort of some sort of intellectual landscape, and I think for me, it became like an obsession, and it was something that I was always going, why does everything feel like a revelation? And why does it feel like I need to get it out? Oh, I had this dream. You'll like this, I bet. I had this dream at the height of like being in a touring band and stuff, where I was on a beach, and it had the feeling of tour. We were on tour, and there was bands everywhere, and I just got it. I figured it out. I felt it everywhere, and I could only describe it as God, because that's the only language I had for it. Oh, it's God. And finally I feel it and I get it. And I got to go over to each individual person there, tell them the steps so that they get it, so that they feel this elation that I feel, this euphoria. So I go to like start telling them, and then all of a sudden they start crowding up on the beach because something's happened. And we look, and it's a piece of shit has flooded, has like, the waves have brought a piece of shit, and everyone's like, oh, there's a piece of shit.
Wow.
And it all escapes me. That feeling like goes away. So for me, I remember sort of waking up and going, that's what it is. I'm feeling this sort of euphoria, or trying to get to this constant state of whatever goosebumps is, just constant goosebumps. Because that to me is what it would be like. Imagine you felt that all the time, that's gotta be what God is, or feeling God is. And then like wanting to get other people involved. Hey, I feel this, bless you. I feel this, and I want you to feel it, and I want you to feel it, I want you to feel it. So we're all in this sort of harmony. But then, hey, shit always gets in the way. You know what I mean? Shit's
Right.
always. So it's like,
that's a crazy dream.
Yeah, it was a wild dream. And I immediately, I was trying to write a book for the longest time. And it was like, oh, it starts with that dream. It's got to start with that dream.
Yeah.
That's why it's so sort of vivid for me. But yeah, that was sort of my experience with it. And then the community part sort of drifted away where it became a burden a little bit. Like we were just hanging out in parking lots instead of actually going into the shows. We would just load in, play, and load out. Then just even having to rely on other people. If I was feeling inspired or I needed to play music, I played drums. So like I needed to get this out and get this stuff out, but I had to rely on someone else showing up and whatever. I think that's why it was such an easy transition to me to go like, oh no, I just like writing. Like I want to, but then that was hard for me because I stopped having sort of an audience. I'd gotten used to having an audience or someone like, hey, we'll put this music out, or we'll put this out, and playing for people. That when the band ended and I went, yeah, no, I just write, it became very solitary and sort of isolating. And I didn't have, it felt like I didn't have anyone around to listen to where I used to have a bunch of people. I could go like, hey, I used to call my friend's phone at the like landline and hope that they wouldn't pick up so I could leave this sort of poem on their answering machine. Song, so I'm picturing them come home from the bars and just hit play and just like, whoa, what's this guy saying? You know what I mean? That was my vision of myself. I was this towny drunk prophet,
Yeah.
and it wasn't really, I don't think, healthy. And I shouldn't, you shouldn't think of yourself as a prophet, because then the only place to go after prophet is martyr, right? So it was kind of like, it was like, okay, I need to martyr myself. I need to be, but I did have this desire to be this good person my whole life. I need to be good. I need to do good by people. And I want people, it probably started as like, I just want people to like me and I'll do whatever that takes. But then it was like, no, I want to be a good person. I want to be someone that people want to show up for at my funeral and say like, that guy was a good guy. That guy really did some good.
Yeah.
And I got it in my head that the only way to do that was to sort of give myself up in order to do good. And that's not healthy and ends up, biting you in the ass, I think, at the end. So I definitely had these unhealthy relationships with the idea of prophet and martyr and revelation and all this stuff. And it's gotta be rooted in my, Catholic upbringing. It has to
Right.
be, a lot of Jesus shit going on that I just,
Yeah.
like, so.
Oh man, there's a lot to unpack there.
Mhm.
Around what time did you start shifting into being like, you know what, I want to put my main focus on just writing as far as your artistic expression?
Probably like 2004-ish. So when I'm like 23, 24. So I went to school for film at Emerson in Boston. And then I was in a touring band. And I sort of looked at both of those things when the band ended, because it was just kind of like, hey, we're not, you get these big ideas of when you're trying to make it in something like, okay, yeah, we're going to go for it. And especially when you're doing things that are better than the next thing, and then people are whispering in your ear, and like, towards the end of doing a band, it was like someone was like, oh, I can probably get you signed to a major label because of this. And it was like, oh, cool, yeah, we'll do that. And then it was like, a label screwed us over, and a thing came out that wasn't supposed to come out, so we couldn't, just like these weird things. And it was just like, at that point, you're like, ugh, I can't keep doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And that was around like 23. I look back now and it's like, you're a child, dude. It's 23. Like you can still try to go. But at that time, it was a lot of it like, feeling like a bum, feeling like a nomad, feeling like all this kind of stuff. So it's just like,
Was it fiction or story writing, or was it poetry writing or creative nonfiction? What were you drawn to at that time?
At that time, I was drawn to, so I was trying to I was always writing little bits, a notebook full of bits that weren't necessarily poems, but they were just these little snippets. And then I would take those for lyrics. And when we really got churning and we got like good at how to record and write and record music, it would just be like, there'd be a song and then I could just go in my notebook and pick and choose and whatever, as opposed to before, you know, we'd write a song and I would immediately go, oh, it's this whole thing that I have. You know, towards the end, I could go, oh, let me pick and choose from over here and build a thing. So I was always writing these little things. And then I was doing screenwriting for film, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And I took poetry classes and personal essay classes and, you know, just writing classes. I just loved. I loved workshopping stuff. I loved, again, that sense of sort of community, that you would have people sit around reading your work and telling you how to make it better, or what like moved them or affected them. Like that's huge. That's such
Oh, yeah.
and that's what it was like being in a touring band, where you're with these other bands that feel these sort of similar to how you feel, and you sit and you go, hey, what were you doing when you were writing that? Or, ooh, this line. And I remember like some of the bands would be like, oh, we just recorded, you know, we just finished recording, and we'd all get in the van and they'd pop it in. And, you know, during certain lines or certain parts, you sort of like massage their little shoulders. Like, what are you doing, guy? How'd you do that? You know? And it's like, you know, so to have those kind of experiences where you have someone's sort of attention and that kind of stuff was, you know, really huge. But so when I stopped when I had a notebook full of snippets and stuff, it felt like a larger thing to me. So it felt like my main goal after the band was to take all these snippets and weave them into a narrative, that all of these, and it was like, oh yeah, I can, you know, I can take this and write this whole, you know, maybe it started maybe as a memoir, and then I was like, well, that's kind of narcissistic and gross. And then I moved it to like a book of short stories. And then even that felt gross. And then I just sort of threw it in the trash, but I like worked on it for, you know, a couple of years before sort of abandoning it, but that's how it sort of works. And then I was drawn to, you know, I'm when I write, I can only do short stuff. I think that's
Yeah,
what
like that too.
yeah, just like I want to be able to make a longer thing, and I'm always thinking about the longer thing. Oh yeah, I finally have this novel, or I have whatever. But I end up just being able to burst out this little short thing, and that's why it's sort of the writing community where, you know, we sort of connected, where it's like, oh, all these things are short and they don't need to have any sort of stuff. It was kind of like, oh, cool, thank God. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I can just throw these things. But then it, you know, obviously that, you know, turns sour for a lot of reasons. But even as a creative, taking all the social grossness out of it, even creative, it became very, it was almost like factory for me, where I was like, okay, let me post these little snippets online. When they pop in my head, beep, beep, beep. Then after a little bit, I probably have enough to piece together in some weird ass thing. Cool, let me submit it to a bunch of places. They accepted it, great. It's published, nice. Then let me put it on my published thing. This is where my, and then, okay, move on and do it again. Like it started being stifling, and it's sort of
like too formulaic or something.
yeah, it was formulaic, and it was just like, and it just again like started feeling gross. It felt like this sort of this need for validation, and this need for needing someone to go, yeah, this is worthy. And then once I realized like, oh God, this is gross what I'm doing, I just completely stopped. And then that's when I started cooking up like a children's book. And then
yeah, I want to ask you about that. Those are
yeah.
some interesting thoughts about the online community, and I feel like I had a very similar experience. I guess I didn't, you know, I know exactly what you mean on the formula of that. And it's like a cul-de-sac or something, or it's like it's ultimately hollow at the end of the day, or maybe, even though I know that, you know, a lot of things I've read from you, I mean, I never felt like those things were hollow, or that they were even formulaic or anything. I felt like you always had beautiful writing. But I did want to talk about your children's book. I don't know when, maybe 2 years ago or so, I had been wanting to order it, and I finally got it, and I read it, and I've read it several times. And it's interesting because I've tried to write some children's books as well. Like, I'm drawn to the idea of that because it can be so, I mean, it's so minimalistic, but it's so powerful. And then challenging yourself to try to write something that might be accessible to a kid, but also is like heightened so that an adult could enjoy it. And I feel like that's what your book does. So the book is called The Day We Lost Pet, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And can you say more about what went into that? Like, was that a book that you had a vision for beforehand, and then you executed it and found a publisher? Or like, how did it go? How did you go about that?
So it was something that I sort of like cooked for probably about 5 years. And it was like, you probably know how these things sort of work. You think of something and you go, oh, there might be something to that. That's interesting. And yeah, I think I can develop that. And then it sits in your brain for a little while. And then another thing happens where you're like, ooh, that's something. And then you kind of go, oh, wait, those are kind of connected. And then it can sort of take shape. So my daughter had a hermit crab, and this is probably 7 or 8 years ago now. She had a hermit crab, and the hermit crab died, right? And she's probably 5 or 6, and she's upset that it died. She feels like it was her fault because she like was supposed to take care of it, whatever it is. And at that time, kids, they're attracted to sort of crude humor, right? So
Yeah.
my way of telling her, of comforting her, try to get her to laugh, and the hermit crab's name was Krabby Patty, and I was like, hey, you remember how Krabby Patty stunk? Like she would fart and it would stink. He's like, yeah. I'm like, you're still gonna smell that, because that doesn't go away. So every now and again, you're gonna take a whiff and it's gonna reek, and you're gonna know it's a Krabby Patty fart, and you're gonna know that she's still here, right? So it's just sort of an off the cuff, whatever. But I went, oh, there's maybe something to that, just sort of like scientifically or whatever, that this stretched out sort of allegory about like we're filled with air, and a little bit of it gets released time and time again as we live, and then when we die, it just goes, all of our air goes out. So I took kind of the crude stuff of it, but I went like, oh, that's something that's kind of interesting. Around that same time, I must have read, there's a poem called You Want a Physicist to Speak at Your Funeral. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I don't think so.
Yeah, but it has that idea, and it was the most, I've been sort of not obsessed with death, but death is definitely a part of sort of everything I try to create for whatever. And this was the most comforting thing I had read about death and grief. And it was basically, it took a science approach, and the physicist is giving sort of the eulogy and just sort of going, hey, that guy was just heat. And as you're fanning yourself off with this sort of program, like, yeah, that heat's here, just that idea of we're all made up of this stuff, and this stuff doesn't go away. So I kind of was like, ooh, I want to make that maybe, but a children's book, sort of, kind of,
Yeah.
And then, so that was the main driving force where I went, oh, that's, I want to teach kids about death. I don't want it to be attached to any sort of religion, because I feel like that's probably what the books are, is like, yeah, if you're good, you go to heaven.
Right.
And that's what death is. So I wanted it to be maybe sort of sciencey, but still have some spirituality to it. And then I was telling my kids one day, inevitably I would be, say I'm tired, or I used to have 12-hour days, and I'd be tired, and maybe I didn't sleep or whatever it is. And it's just me and my kids at that point, like as a single dad. And I would inevitably get fired up and yell at the kids or whatever. And I started saying, hey, look, I'm me with all my stuff. You're you with all your stuff. Us is in here. The us of it is in between us. So let's try to only bring the best parts of, I'll only bring the best parts of me to us. You only bring the best parts of you to us. So again, I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea, that us is the space in the middle.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, oh, there's something to that. Like, what a good explanation of love. And hey, some of me goes into you, and so then I went, oh, that's something. And then I went, oh, yeah, that's part of the death the death thing too. And
Right.
then inevitably it became like, oh, okay, so it's a balloon, it's a balloon scenario. So essentially it's like it's an allegory or whatever for death using balloon people, but it started with, an androgynous god made out of stars blows up blows up sort of a human balloon, and that God is in there somewhere too. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's definitely this idea of like the space between us is holy, and what happens when you realize that you can blow it all out, and that's what procreation is. It's sort of like this all could end, but I love you, and I love this space, but it could all end. How do we preserve this usness? Oh, we put it into another being. We have a baby. Oh,
Right.
that's how you preserve that. And then so that idea, those ideas of love and procreation and death, yeah, and sort of like the science of it and some spiritual stuff. The most like the part of writing that's been so great for me is to hear from people that have different religious backgrounds than I do, and going, oh yeah, no, that there's part of that in this religion, whether it be sort of like Hindu or whether it be like from the Jewish faith, and people that I've talked to, like, oh yeah, no, there's parts of that in where I come from, and it's like, oh,
Yeah, I love that, because it doesn't, I mean, it definitely has a strong spiritual quality, but it's not like you're not using religion specific language. So that's awesome that people from different traditions have been like, yeah, I can see that, there's an element of that in my own tradition, and you made it kind of, you made it expansive enough so that a lot of people feel connected to it. I mean, I know when I read it, yeah, I was really struck by it, and it's moving. You said earlier that, being moved. I felt moved by it for sure. Well, we could talk about writing for a long time, but I do want to shift gears a little bit, because you said that really amazing dream, and I'm always curious. This podcast basically started as a way for me to ask people about weird experiences that they've had, and then it kind of evolved into me just asking people about their whole spiritual history in a way. But I want to continue the asking people about their weird experiences as one component of the podcast. So are there any mysterious or mystical or synchronistic or even paranormal experiences that you've had throughout the years that you can think of that you might want to share?
Nothing honestly really jumps out to me. I think, in thinking of this stuff, there is divinity in just coincidence. And I do feel like there's a lot of coincidence in my life that I can't necessarily chalk up to just random acts. And I think that's where spirituality comes from, is this idea that you see stuff out there and you go, well, this just can't be all that random. Obviously it comforts us to know that it's not, but there's stuff that's too beautiful, and there's stuff that's too on the nose that you go, okay, there's something more to it. But as far as like some big thing, I can't really say there is. I mean, I think like me and probably a lot of other people, you visit with people that have gone in dreams. And I know for me, one of the biggest things I do when I see someone that has died in my dreams, I have a good time, and then I ruin the good time by remembering that they're gone, and I remember that they're dead. And I always go, one of my best friends died when I was 19, and I'll have dreams where I'm hanging out and everybody's hanging out and we're having so much fun, and it's so good to see him. And it's like, oh, this is amazing. And then I must, in my dream consciousness, go, why doesn't this happen more? And then I remember, oh yeah, you're dead. And then I go, hey, you're dead. And I start crying, and I just, you talk about ruining the party, being and like everyone gets mad, and he gets like, my friend who's died, he gets so pissed. It's almost like, hey, we don't talk about that. We're here, I'm back, I'm visiting. This is for sort of goodness. So I feel like that a lot of times, where I wake up and I feel, again, this guilt, like, oh shit, I ruined that party because I reminded him that he's dead. And it happens sometimes with other people too, but mainly this dude that's been dead for like 20 years now, where we'll hang out and it's like, and I think there is, even in my dream, there's this guilt about, hey, I've lived for 20 years that you haven't. And he was someone that, in the music, to tie it into the music stuff, he's someone that I would go to shows with, and we shared music in common and stuff. But he stayed sort of like hardcore and like metal stuff, and I veered towards probably more like chilled out, sort of like the emo stuff back in the mid to late 90s. So there was a big divide in like my music community, where it was like, oh wait, what's all this stuff over here, like, who are these guys and why is this affecting me so much? And then a lot of them stayed sort of, no, we want it heavy and we want it screaming and we want whatever. So I had a dream one time where we were at a show, and it was like a hardcore show, but I was there, and it was almost like it was in honor of him. And he got so mad at me that I was like standing on the side of the stage, and it was like he was pissed that I wasn't like in the pit, or like I wasn't doing like sing-alongs and stuff. And I had to go, like, man, I'm old. Like I'm 30, like I'm 38, and this isn't my like I'm here for you, and I'm doing this, but I can't do all that shit. Like, you're still 20, you're still 21 because you died. Like,
right.
But I aged and I lived. And again, like, everybody was pissed at me for bringing it up and whatever. And it's just like, oh shit. So it's really, anytime I have anything sort of spiritual in that way, it always comes back to sort of death or dreams or but nothing really.
No, that's fascinating.
Yeah, nothing that really sort of, no sort of paranormal stuff. And again, I just sort of believe, I think, in energy, like that shows up in my book, and the idea that, love has vibrations and love has energy. And if you love people and you love hard and you're good to people, then there's no way you sort of go away. So,
right.
And
yeah.
maybe that's part of the goosebumps, and maybe that's part of what we recognize and why we're moved, because you can tell that love has gone into something, and it or it is able to sort of cross over. But I'm not sure. My dad's interesting. Have you watched the OA?
No, I haven't. I know about it, but I haven't watched it.
Yeah, you would maybe be into it. But so this happened recently. My brother-in-law's dad was over at my parents' house, and we were there, and we were like by a fire, and he just casually sort of says, my brother-in-law's dad says that he had a near-death experience, that as when he was like 19 or 20, he was working on building a house or something, and a big beam came back and knocked him in the skull, and he went down, and as he was down there, he was going in somewhere, he was hearing voices, and he was being drawn somewhere. And then he figured out what was happening, and he said, like, no, not yet. And then he was sort of back, right? And my dad is an atheist, like I said, and he doesn't believe in that stuff. So this guy tells this story, and he is feeling pretty vulnerable, like, oh, people don't believe me, whatever. And I'm just kind of like affirming him, like, no, that's great, that's beautiful. And it informed how he lived his life, because it was almost like he was comforted, like, oh, I know what death is going to be like, and it's very peaceful and comfortable. So obviously he's lived 30-ish more years, and that must have informed how he went about being a person. And of course my dad's sitting there and going, hey, yeah, no disrespect, but probably the voices you were hearing were like the people around you. There were actual voices, and you think you're going into a light, it's probably an actual light that in the ambulance or whatever, you know what I mean? And my dad's just kind of going like, that's what I believe. And I'm sitting there going, if a story, and this is sort of from the OA, if a story changes your life, does it matter if it's true or not? My dad has to find some sort of truth, and doesn't necessarily maybe subscribe to the power of story and the power of allegory and analogy like I do. And I think if we're talking about religion and the organized religion and dogma and doctrine and all that stuff, wow, the power of story, right? As writers, we see that the power of, and my problem has always been like, yeah, you're not supposed to take all this stuff literally.
Yep.
You know, it's all sort of figurative, and you're supposed to find, it's supposed to change your life somehow, even if
Yes.
in a tiny way. And you shouldn't worry about if it's true or not.
Yeah.
And you're worried about if it's true or not. If someone picks up my book and goes, and a kid goes, did this really happen? Was there really balloon people that, I don't want to say, no, it didn't really happen. It's just kind of like, why does it matter? And these balloon people are you. We're all the balloon people, So I think with that, it's like, and it goes back to this idea of always searching for this big sort of truth or whatever. When you're looking at it skeptically, like, oh, it's going to be true, or if it changes my life, I'm a fucking sucker, and that idea. And I think that's what my dad looks at it as, like, oh, if I would love to believe that, because that's great, that it's going to be comforting when I die and whatever. But if that's not true, if I die and it's terrible and painful and whatever, then I've been a sucker for my whole life.
Yeah.
I think there's that fear there and that cynicism that, and I don't try to sway him in any way, but I just kind of go like, yeah, but isn't that beautiful for this guy right here? Like, it informs his whole life, and he believes it to be true, and he's lived a life. He's here now, and you obviously enjoy his company and enjoy him. So like, what does it matter what he takes away from that experience?
Right. No, I totally feel what you're saying. I mean, once I got into reading books in college, and it started with novels. I don't really read much novels these days, but yeah, I just like acknowledge the power of stories at that time. And Joseph Campbell has always been a huge inspiration to me. And Joseph Campbell was, just such a master at, obviously highlighting the power of stories and showing the parallels between all these mythologies around the world, and what the allegorical impact they could have on our lives. Like you're saying, I mean, I guess it's like the way to gauge the power of a story is not like whether it's true, but how much can it change your life. I think that's a kind of a beautiful way to look at it. I'm super fascinated by near-death experiences. I've like watched documentaries about that and read a couple books, and it's I don't even know. I don't know what conclusions to make on that sort of thing, but I know that something's going on. And also, one of my best friends is a hospice chaplain, so I asked him about his experiences with people who are dying. Just because I'm curious, like how have those experiences changed his life, and what are some common kind of common attitudes that people who are dying have, and what he has said, as well as what I've heard some other people with a lot of that experience have said, like, is that the people who are dying are actually, they start really letting go of things in a positive way. They let go of so much of the things that have been weighing them down throughout the years, and they're actually not afraid usually. This one guy said he's I can't remember who this guy was. He was some sort of religious person who had been working with people who were dying for decades, and he said that not one of the people that he asked are you afraid, the closer they got to death, the more they were unafraid. He said that none of them said that they were still afraid at that point. If they had any fear, it was just a fear for the their loved ones who were who might, they would be afraid that they would hope that everybody was going to be taken care of after they passed and stuff like that. But yeah, so I just think that there is a lot of interesting stuff obviously around death, and I feel like death always pops up in my poetry, or at least it used to, maybe even more. And I mean, how couldn't it? Like
Honestly.
Carlos Castaneda, in one of his books that I read last year, the Don Juan character says something like, either death is the ultimate advisor or death is the greatest teacher, or something like that. And it's kind of true, you know. I mean, I think that just having the container of death at the very least, like, who knows what happens after we die? I really don't know. But having the acknowledgement that at the very least, like, we are going to die as we know ourselves right now, it provides this really generative, like, contrast to the fact that we're alive right now. So it's like, okay, that's there, I'm alive right here, and I need to be here now, you know, type of thing.
Yeah. Oh, big time. I wrote a thing where I was trying to talk about these sort of, hey, when I talk about this word, this is what I'm saying. And for death, it was like, the measurement by which we cherish time. You know, when I talk about death, that's what I'm talking about. The measurement by which we cherish time, the fact that it's finite. And what I've started thinking about a lot is this idea of infinity. There's infinity. We think about maybe infinity after us, and we rarely think about infinity before us. There was an infinity before me, and there's going to be an infinity after me. So I just got this little vessel for a little bit. So I think, like, returning, you know, like the Zen thing that you started with with the returning to the sort of the infinite. Like, I was infinite before. Now I'm here to cherish what I got and what to do, and I'm just going to return to sort of the infinite. You know, the closer you get to that, maybe you can start feeling that, like, oh, I'm just, you know, this idea of, hey, yeah, I'm sort of, you know, I know it's trite to say now, like, that we're all one or whatever, but you must sort of oneness, like, oh no, I'm just melting right back into the shit, man. I'm just not, and this is not great at all, because hell yeah, it's going to be good. And then, you know, for me, it's like, I don't believe necessarily in reincarnation, and it shows up in my children's book, this idea that if I'm gonna, you know, and I talk about it with my fiance, because we feel like we were probably swirling around in the infinite before us, and then, you know, we were maybe wrapped up in the same person at some point, and now all those bits are in that body, because it was felt like such a return to something, like meeting and falling. Was like, oh, this is a return to, this is familiar, and this is a return to something. Oh, maybe in the dust before we had our little skin stuff, we were, know. So this idea, like, I don't believe in reincarnation, that all of a sudden I'm going to wake up and I'm a baby again. But maybe, you know, when I return to the infinite, some of that infinite's going to get sucked back into a skin bag, and that skin bag's going to go on and whatever. Like, this idea of sort of energy doing stuff. But yeah, any creative person, how can you not, you know, and maybe that's the big and the big truth that I've always been, you know, trying to seek, is when we talk about, hey, what's the meaning of life? Maybe we're really talking about, like, how do we serve this time the best before we die, you know?
Yes, sir.
And, you know, that's a big thing. And for me, and being a high school teacher and stuff, and especially like in the arts and all that kind of stuff, I've started looking at God as something inside us, you know, this sort of magnet that draws us to different people, to different experiences or whatever, and how important it is to sort of keep that magnet clean and shine, so that it's really, you know, got dirt and shit crusted on it. It's not gonna draw you where like genuinely you're supposed to go or you want to go. And I think, you know, for me, that idea sort of started with, on the flip side, where if you're drawn to someone, or if you're around someone, and your first instinct is to bury the God inside you. Oh, I used to say this thing where I'm out back burying the God inside me, and you're making lemonade trying to keep me hydrated, you know, for the hard work I'm making of it. If that's the first instinct, you got to get away from that person. You want to be drawn to the people where, again, it feels like a call to home, where it's magnets coming together. I talked to a friend of mine. I had him come in and talk to my class He like co-writes songs and stuff that have become big songs. And he was, when I told him that, because I'm trying to tell my students that, like, hey, go where you feel drawn, and it's okay to pivot if you feel drawn somewhere else, but make sure
Totally.
make sure it's pure, make sure it's not, you're not going somewhere for any other reason. And I sort of said that to him, and he said, yeah, like the voice, listening to the voice inside yourself and making sure you're not sort of clouding that. He's sober, he's like 15 years sober or something like that. So I think for him it took on like I was sort of drowning that voice out a little bit with drugs and alcohol and stuff, and I needed to clean it up so that it could sort of get louder and I could listen to it easier. And I was kind of like, oh yeah, there's something to that. So that's how I've started looking at stuff. So in that way, when we die, the God inside us just goes back to, and maybe when I say God, I mean the infinity inside us, or something like that. But I think that's why we create. We know our time is limited. And for me, definitely in the height of my sort of narcissism as a 18, 19-year-old dude, that had a platform, it was like, this is going to outlive me. I'm going to die, my body, I'm going to die, but someone somewhere is always going to be able to find this thing that I made or this thing that I did. And that was like really important to me for whatever reason. And like, who's going to buy, a CD is not even going to exist, but who's going to stumble upon a CD made in 2001 about getting drunk with your friends and going like, oh yeah, fucking immortality. You know what I mean?
Hey, you never know. People might find that somehow and love it. But I know exactly what you mean. I there's an element of that that's always lurking, I think, where it's like, it's weird because a lot of times even with this podcast, I don't even really market it. I don't really share it that much. I'll share it with, close friends here and there, but it's almost one of those things where I'm more interested in somebody in the future finding it than somebody finding it now for some reason. And there's a lot that goes into that, but yeah, I love what you're saying. And, I think of God as the infinite these days. That's one way to think of it. It's weird because I have like a bunch of different like viewpoints on God these days. And I think it should be, I think that acting like we have any sort of conclusion about that sort of thing is like short-sighted. I always, the mystery is at the heart of it. And so I think of God as the mystery. I think of God as the infinite. I really like what you're saying about the magnet thing, like polishing the magnet or cleaning the magnet so that it's so that it's kind of more in tune with our environment, and it kind of pull us toward things that are actually going to be healthy and constructive for our lives rather than the opposite. And the ways that we cloud those magnets and kind of dull the batteries or something like, and I think about God as the one and God as the all, and God as the totality of all possible realities. Like there's so many different ways to look at God. And, for the longest time, I hesitated to even use the word God because it just has so much baggage. But this dude that I like, his name's Forrest Church. He says something along the lines of God is the name, or God is the word that we use for that which is greater than all, but is present in each, So it's like this idea that God is always immanent. That ultimately, to me, there's kind of nothing that is not God. Like I can't quite ever pull anything away from it being God in some way. But at the same time, God transcends all, because you can never ultimately define God. I don't think you can never ultimately explain God, or conceptualize or put God in some sort of box, so God always transcends at the same time.
Yeah, for me, it's always, when we think of like, there's the concrete and the abstract, God is just, God. It's the only concrete way I have to say a thing. But I felt that way too with the baggage of like, I want to say God a bunch, and I want God to come up in my writing and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That comes with so many connotations, and it's just like, no, I just mean sort of the God as in the joy of not knowing,
Mm,
the sort of unknown. And I think for me, again, that was a big transition where like the freedom associated with you're never going to pin it down. You're never going to know it.
mhm, mhm,
That can be terrifying. I think for someone like my father, it's terrifying, but for
mhm,
me, it's very freeing. And I think that happened when I was around 23 that I went, oh, God is whatever I want it to be. And oh,
mm,
how did I not know that? And oh, I can take bits of all these different things. And, it's almost like, yeah, I'm going to build my own religion, not a cult where I'm going to get people involved, but just a religion of one for one, and
yeah,
just take these pieces and these bits and I can feel what I want to feel that God is. And that can always change. And yeah, I think we're always going to try to sort of pin it down, or we're
yeah,
always going to try to be the filter through which infinity can sort of flow through in whatever way it can. But yeah, it's beautiful that no one's ever going to be able to be like, yeah, no, you had it right. You nailed it. That one. Oh, I love there's on the Good Place, that TV shows,
yeah,
they're in a heaven or whatever it is. And it's just like, oh, we're the Christians, right? We're this, right? It was like, oh, no one really got it right except for this one dude. This one time he stumbled upon it when he was like high on mushrooms. He got like super close, and they just have a picture of like this 30-year-old guy, and like and that's sort of what's hilarious to me, is that there's never going to be this idea of like you've been duped or you gave your life over to something that ended up being fake. If it was a good life, if you did good and you felt good, then it was sort of worthy of whatever story you believed. But
yes, yeah,
if you hear that story and it makes you go like, oh, well, I got to hate this person, I got to hate these people because that's what sort of a deity says, then you screwed up. And we've had that throughout history. And I think that's where there's a problem, where it's like, oh,
yeah,
that's not what are you doing over there? Oh, my God says I do this. Oh boy, my God says the exact opposite. So I need to, you know what I mean? And it's like, how do we, obviously we've moved away from it sort of, or at least sort of in the Western world, but that's the part that I think that causes the baggage with the word God too,
oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Well, hey, I'm not even sure what time it is because my phone won't let me look at the time right now. What time is it actually?
It's 4:15 my time. So what is that, 1:15 your time?
Okay, sweet. So let's wrap it up. I mean, we've
Do
gotten
it.
to some really good stuff here. I guess just as a final question, because usually I try to ask people about experience, which we've talked a lot about, philosophy, spiritual philosophy, or your own kind of view on these matters, which we've talked about, and then practices. So I was curious, like, are there any explicitly spiritual practices or even just any rituals or um patterns in your life that you want to preserve, that kind of keep you aligned with the life that you want to live?
I want there to be, but currently there's not. And I feel like the way that I thrive is when I'm so sort of routine, and like when I feel like my body is working in such an efficient way that it lets my heart sort of be open and my brain be open, which I didn't understand was a part of like maybe getting into shape, or what we don't correlate what we put into our bodies enough with what we put out. I don't think you hear
Yeah,
people like, hey, junk in, junk out. But there was a period in my life, a little while ago, where I really focused on what I put into my body, and had this idea that like, that other things are sort of dimming my shine or screwing up my magnet or whatever it was. So it was like, I was like, yeah, I gotta sort of, be sort of clean in the way that I live. And there was definitely some like, okay, I don't want to be like this blob of a human being. I want to, look okay and feel okay. But
yeah,
I wasn't prepared for what it did for me sort of spiritually and in my mind, where it was just like, my body got so used to what I was putting into it and when and how I was moving it, that it like opened itself up to sort of the light. So I think
cool. Nice.
I think that's sort of how I could look at it, and just being this like creature of routine and habit that then allows for this to come in. And I imagine that's sort of like, I sort of understood the appeal of yoga, but I wasn't doing yoga, but it was like
Hmm.
when I would stretch my body, it just felt so good. And I was like, and I've always been curious about meditation. So I'm like, oh, yoga is just like meditating while stretching your muscles. Fucking rules. So there's stuff like that that I want to, I picture myself sort of getting into, but I think for the most part, it's just like being a machine in my, so I don't have to worry about all that kind of stuff, worry about the physical stuff. Like, oh yeah, I got to put stuff in my body so that it goes and it's got fuel. If that's just taken care of and that's sort of on autopilot, then I'm free. The infinite in me is free to sort of feel everything.
Yeah.
And sort of be outside. I definitely want to be outside more, be present, with the people that I care about, be kind to the people that I care about. So, and I feel like that helps me as well. When I'm not putting shit into my body, and when I'm like prioritizing sleep and all that kind of stuff, I feel like I'm kinder to people.
Yeah.
Which, opens things up too. I just want to be sort of open. I want to let good stuff out and have good stuff come in. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's beautiful, Chuck. This was
Well,
really fun. I hope you had fun too.
I love this. I appreciate you thinking of me. It's whenever you think of me, I always appreciate it. And you've thought of me, the right amount of times in these last
Yeah.
8 years.
I mean, out of
Like,
that
hey, can I
community,
get something from you? I'm like, hell yeah, let's go. And then you'll be like, hey, I bought your book. I'm like, let's go.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, you always end up popping up, and yeah, I've had dreams about you.
Oh yeah, that's great. I love that.
Yeah, you always have stood out to me as somebody that I always assumed that we would have a good bit in common and stuff. So
Yeah,
it's cool because I anticipate having part twos with a lot of people, a lot of my guests. So I would love to have a part two if you're down sometime.
definitely.
And it's like whenever that happens, I will just listen back to this episode and kind of develop some new directions that we could go with this as our foundation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
But I hope best of luck with everything. I enjoy your teaching, and I'm happy for you and your fam. Happy for you and your fiance. Hope you keep polishing the magnet.
Yeah, buddy.
And we'll talk soon. All right.
All right, man. Appreciate you. We'll see you.
Peace, brother.